Hey guys, so this is a different style of recording, I guess. We did review this footage on stream. However, there were so many like title mistakes and like match recording. So I think the majority of the time, I had the match score at 1-1. Even at the beginning, I just forgot to change it. So I thought that I would just take the raw footage and commentate over it. I spent a lot of like the first game and probably a good portion of game two just talking to the chat and responding to their stuff. So it was a little less analytical than what I would usually do. So I just thought I would just cut it this way. And I think for like ongoing, like future YouTube videos, whatever footage that we do get, and this will happen a lot with the Enter the Battlefield footage, is a lot of the games I don't review that we have footage for, I will most likely just do this format and just edit it separately and not have the stream. It's a lot cleaner. It doesn't have, obviously, it doesn't have the Twitch chat. It doesn't have myself. If you prefer me on there, I can do that for later games and later matches. Um, if it's not me, it'll probably just be like the cartoon avatar version of me, but opted not to do it this time just because it takes up space, and I understand that if I'm not streaming it and I'm not cutting these video matches from the stream, then it doesn't really need to be there. I think you guys just want to watch the gameplay and hopefully hear some subpar analytical commentary because we're all here learning Legacy. Like I've been playing Magic for quite a while, but not competitively. I don't have that competitive mindset. Um, yeah. So we have Nick as player two on 8cast. He starts off with Otawara, Mishra's Bauble, Lotus Petal into turn one Emery. On Fernando's side, player one looks like he has a Wooded Foothills, casting the Force Will to counter the Emery. Um, yeah. So his hand, Wooded Foothills, Pendlehaven draws a third Wooded Foothills and has Wasteland. I didn't know that he played Wasteland in his Infect list. But starts off with Wooded Foothills. Very light on the threats. I believe this is his Infect list. There is the Pendlehaven, so I think Legacy Infect is the only deck that would play the Pendlehaven. Here's a turn two Psy from Nick. So he gets that early Psy down. Can't really see the rest of his hand. I don't know if he has any. He doesn't clearly doesn't have any zero drop artifacts to build up his Thopters. Otherwise, he would have cast them. But relatively a weak hand for Psy. You generally want to be keeping hands where you're casting either Emery or Psy on turn one and then just unloading. Like if you have Emery, it was like a perfect hand for Emery. Unfortunately, it got countered. But the Psy, there's not a lot of follow ups, and it kind of depended on the Emery recasting the Mishra's Bauble from the graveyard to just accrue extra Thopters every time he cast it from the graveyard, and that's its like the Emery is the engine rather than the rest of the cards in his hand. But we see that he has Thoughtcast in hand. He opts to crack the Bauble. I think I wouldn't have done that just because he has the Thoughtcast and it looks like there's a Kappa Cannoneer in his hand now. But he just has no artifacts, and this as an affinity based deck, he kind of needs the artifacts to cast these other cards in his graveyard or in his hand. So cracking the Bauble, like I guess the idea is to dig one deeper to get another artifact, but if you're cracking an artifact just to hopefully draw another artifact, it's kind of a really bad position anyway. I guess it from his point of view, it was it's not like a incorrect play. I think it was just a bad play because now this Emery is full cost. anytime you draw like an affinity card, having no artifacts just makes you in such a worse position. It's a good thing that Fernando kept a hand that didn't have any action in it. But he was on a Malta 6. He opted to play a control plan. I guess not knowing what Nick was on, he because he previously played Reanimator, so Fernando opted to maybe keep a hand of the Force of Will just to make sure that if he was still playing Reanimator, then he wouldn't have been blown out of the water. And they kind of would have been in a similar position. But now that Nick was on 8 cast, he doesn't have like a very quick or fast clock. And if you haven't played against 8 cast before, it grinds pretty decently well. So Fernando top decks a Windswept Heath. He seems to draw lands a lot, but he does have this Inkmoth Nexus, which is a hard clock for Nick to interact with, just because it's a land. He does have the Otawara just as an emergency, but it's not an answer in any way. It returns it to his hand, and I think it doesn't even target lands. There's a Vines of Vastwood kicked on the Inkmoth Nexus, so swinging for 6 poison right now, because he did pump it with the Pendelhaven. I think Nick is considering Force of Willing, but just takes it instead. I've been focusing a lot on Nick. I haven't seen what's in Fernando's hand. Nick top decks a Mishra's Bauble. Looks like Fernando has land Daze. So now this Emery is easy to cast. It's now 1 mana. All thanks to Sai. It looks like there's a lot of thought casts in his hand. So if he can get this Emery on the board, then he should be in a pretty good position. Very strange how he played Otawara, floated mana. It's a very strange tactic. He mills a Pithing Needle, which, if he can survive, it'll be very good. Because then he can name the Inkmoth Nexus, and he basically takes away Fernando's current threat. But Sai, a very good matchup, especially with the threat that Fernando has. Like, Inkmoth Nexus's evasion is flying, unlike Blighted Agent's unblockable. So as long as, although it doesn't look like it, as long as Nick can cast artifacts, he blocks very well. But he is very artifact light. So again, Nick cracks a Mishra's Bauble to draw 1 card deeper. So this Emery is now on and in a very good position. So there's a top deck Bauble. I think he top decked 2 Baubles. So here comes all of the affinity that Nick needs. His Thought Casts now cost 1. His Cannoneers are now extremely easy to cast using the improvised mechanic. And then if he needs to, the Pithing Needle is still in the yard for Nick to cast. Looks like he is going to go for a Chalice over the Pithing Needle. Nope, he's going to go for the Pithing Needle. So it seemed like he didn't use the mana that he floated when he played the second Otawara, so I'm really confused by that strategy. So Fernando tries to daze the Pithing Needle. Nick has the extra mana to tap for it. Pithing Needle resolves. So I'm gonna assume that it's naming the Inkmoth Nexus and not the Pendelhaven. So now Nick is in like an extremely dominant position. If Fernando doesn't deploy a secondary threat here, Nick can easily just choose Chalice in the graveyard with the Emery ability and cast Chalice on one, and it turns off Glistener Elf. If he's feeling a little cavalier, he can try and get to 4 mana and cast Chalice on 2 for Blighted Agent, but doesn't seem like that's gonna happen. I think I would have done this differently. I think I would have tried to fire off at least one Thought Cast before committing to the Chalice line. Um, I think it's a safer, not a safer, but I think it's the better play because we see that he has Force of Wills in hand. He should be digging deeper for like mana sources. Even if Fernando is able to land a Glistener Elf, it doesn't kill him in one turn. So I think Nick could afford to just not play the Chalice this turn and just try to get some mana on the board. But having the Cyan Emery engine is just an extremely powerful strategy and tactic that he should have this game under control at this point. So we've seen Fernando play this deck quite a bit. Um, I have very I don't have as much experience playing the Infect matchup as he does, but I kind of don't agree with how he plays it sometimes. I understand he might have been using prior knowledge to try and not die to Reanimator immediately, but I'm in the firm fact or in the camp of just play every game or every match in its own right. Sometimes you just lose to Reanimator and you have to accept that. So keeping a hand with Force of Will and a bunch of lands, not great when you're the hyper aggressive deck like Infect. Like Infect very rarely is the control deck in a matchup, and when you keep hands that play that kind of strategy from the opener, this starts to happen where you're extremely light on threats and a single card can shut down your entire strategy. So if I would have preferred if I was in Fernando's shoes, I would have mulliganed to 5. I really would like. Well, I would have definitely wanted a threat much earlier. And now Fernando, almost all of Fernando's threats are turned off. Like even the Noble Hierarch route. If Nick was ever using the Ancient Tombs a lot, he can't even get through regular points of damage. It gets countered by the Chalice of the Void. So all of his threats are turned off. I don't think he has a main board. Like the main board way of him dealing with a Pithing Needle is Teferi, but I'm pretty sure he only plays a one of, and Nick has the Force of Will for it no matter what. So although Nick kept a slower hand, which was absolutely fine because he had turn 1 Emery into turn 2 Sai and hopefully start making Thopters from there, he was just in a dominant position. I don't know. If I ever get like heavy into like editing and making these kinds of videos like over my stream, like cut up matches, I don't know what to call them. Um, but you know those meters that chess streamers use, or the chess programs that has the black and white advantage meter. That would be pretty fun to put onto one of these um, kind of edited videos where I just talk over it with commentary. The issue is that advantages and disadvantages at my level of experience are very subjective. So even if I considered Fernando or Nick at a disadvantaged position at one point, it's not definitive evidence or backed up by any data, and it's all opinionated. So people could disagree with me, which is completely fine. But I don't want to put like a meter up there if it's not, you know, on solid evidence or data. So Nick boarding in a bunch of single target removal. That's what he needs to do to kind of stop Fernando. So I think there's 3 dismembers, 2 brazen borers coming in. I don't think there's anything else. Looks like he's cutting Kappa Cannoneers. I'm a big fan of usually dropping down some baubles. However, if Nick opts to continuously use Psy aggressively to block the Inkmoth Nexus, so to use it as like kind of like a light answer, baubles are extremely good and hard to cut. Yeah. So it looks like Nick is not bringing in Brazen Borers. It looks like it's Flusterstorm 3 Dismembers. Flusterstorm pretty good if Fernando is like very heavy on the protection. Fernando bringing in 2 Besejus, Collector Oof, Apostle's Blessing. All very good options. Especially the Apostle's Blessing. So I think I was talking with him and he was telling me that Apostle's Blessing not often played in Legacy Infect, and I'm very surprised by that. It's a 1 mana protection spell. Yeah, it doesn't buff, but I think ever since Modern Horizons 2 was printed and Psy is very common, and 8 cast has just become a very common deck, you like having the protection from blockers is very strong. So a big thing that Nick cut was a Shadow Spear. Hopefully, I think you can't expect Fernando to ever go on the regular damage plan of Noble Hierarchs, but it's always an option to him, so that's something that you would need to consider. So you can cut the Shadow Spear. It is viable. You just have to be much more careful about using your Ancient Tombs and your Dismembers, because just like that's a lot of life that you're chipping away from yourself. So although we don't have Shocklands, it does make up for it through the Phyrexian mana symbols and the Ancient Tomb usage. Fernando obviously bringing in the double Besage is extremely important. Um, Chalice not so popular, not as popular at least with Eldrazi Stompy not being in the format. Chalice on 1 in main game or game 1, not as often as it is. Although it has probably stabilized and like evened out to be neutral because of the rise of 8 cast and just the like how good Urza Saga is. I guess it doesn't really matter because of Urza Saga, but if you're playing Urza Sagas, you're more likely to be playing artifacts and like turn 1 Chalice on 1. So Fernando plays Wooded Foothills, cracks it, probably going for a Tropical Island. Solid hand from Nick. I didn't see, did he have a threat there? It looks like it's double Thought Monitor. But he does have the Chalice on 1. So he has to be very careful, and he has to sniff out a Force of Will from Fernando. I think it's more important to kind of land the Chalice rather than using the Chalice to bait out a Force. Although, if Fernando plays a turn 1 clock, then baiting out the Chalice is fine with or baiting out the Force of Will with the Chalice is fine. But again, it looks like Fernando kept another hand with no threat. Does keep a Ponder though, so helps dig for 1. I don't know if I'm wrong to think that Infect is the hyper aggressive deck. I know it is a combo. Like it's very similar. Like it's a fast creature combo, not creature combo. It's a fast aggressive, like I guess combo, like aggro combo deck. It needs a lot of pieces for a combo win, but I do consider it just like a hyper aggressive deck. It should never be playing like the control game plan. So with that being said, like this is another opening hand that I really don't like that Fernando kept. Like he's on the play, he doesn't have a threat, he's not threatening victory. So Nick can just kind of do whatever he wants to do. Well, he gets a blighted agent, so I guess everything I said up until now is just irrelevant. Nick tries to play Chalice on 1. Oh, he's playing around the days. So very good on Nick's part. Tries to play Chalice on 1. Fernando, Force of Will's exiling Force of Will. So now Fernando has to be thinking, like, does he have the Force of Will for this? Down comes Noble Hierarch, light on the lands. So opting to take some time here instead of brainstorming gives him an extra turn to draw a card. So I think if Nick has any baubles in his hand, he shouldn't be cracking them. I think getting these thought monitors out of his hand and onto the battlefield to draw him cards is more important. So he technically has 3 mana, but no blue source for this thought monitor. So there is a Seat of the Synod, though. So the Seat of the Synod representing 2 mana. He could be opting to play, I think that's an Urza Saga. Here's Seat of the Synod. So he has technically 5 mana for the Thought Monitor. He has 2 artifacts, making it 5. Then he has Seat and Ancient Tomb. Oh, there's another Lotus Petal. So this changes the math considerably. So he has 3 artifacts for Thought Monitor, decreasing it by 3, making it 4 mana. Then he has Seat of the Synod and Ancient Tomb for 3 mana. And then he can crack one of the Lotus Petals for an extra like source of mana. So that's a tricky thing that a few people don't know, is that when calculating affinity, like mana costs, you can count the artifact for Lotus Petal and then also crack it for mana. So they're also technically 2 mana for affinity creatures or cards. So down comes Thought Monitor. Just having being able to raw cast it. Fernando opts to play the 3rd Force of Will. So now Nick is in a little bit of trouble here. Every play that he's tried to do has been met with counter, and he has a very strong threat on the board. So here, Fernando is attacking for 6 poison. Cast an Invigorate for free. I think it's +3 actually. I think it might be 5 poison that he's attacking for. Let me just check. Because he's getting +1 off the Exalted trigger. He has the Vines of Vast, which to make up the difference. So that's a quick win. It is +4/+4 off the Invigorate. So that was exactly 10 poison. Blight Agent, a 1/1, becomes a 2/2 off of the Exalted trigger of Noble Hierarch. Then gets +4 off the Invigorate, and then another +4 off the kicked Vines of Vastwood. So now Nick gets to go on the play. I don't think he'll make any changes. You know, I guess the advantage of playing Chalice on 1 before Fernando can kind of set up any extra mana or anything. You can also Chalice on 1 to, you know, kind of get ahead of the Glistener Elf as long as it doesn't get countered. So Fernando opting to cut Dazes over trying to cut a Daze for Spell Pierce. I don't think he wants to do that. I think they're both bad on the play. Like, I think even a Pithing Needle on Emery might be worth it. I don't think Endurances could be worth it, but it doesn't help your overall game plan. Although it does help if you're trying to go on the damage game plan. It also is a threat that can get over turn like a Chalice on 2. I didn't see if Nick made any changes. I don't think he would. I think it's solid to have a. Actually, I might have swapped a Flusterstorm for a Brazen Borer. But Flusterstorm is just as good. I think it's a little bit more reactive, but sometimes Brazen Boar is just isn't enough. Looks like they're both keeping sevens. Nick, very weak turn one opener. There's no Chalice, no Emery, no Sai. Even like a Thought Cast on turn one would be like a reason to keep a hand. But this is a very weak showing from the 8 cast opener. Here's a turn one Ponder from Fernando. I guess there's like an overall or overarching general rule where if you have an opener with Ponder, it's okay to keep. However, most of the decks that implore this kind of rule are like control or mid-range style decks and not aggressive decks. However, Fernando's hand looks very good. There's double force of will backup. There's a pumping from Pendelhaven, and he has protection with Apostle's Blessing that helps him attack through Nick's colorless artifact blockers. So almost a perfect hand from Fernando, I'd say. I think anything that would make it better is if he had like the turn one Glistener Elf instead of the turn one Ponder. Because I think he might have shown a Blighted Agent in hand, and if he does, that means he would have had double threat, which is all the more better. So he does have a Blighted Agent in the hand. So Nick cracks the Mishra's Bauble to draw an extra card. One of them was Mox Opal. He is just passing the turn. Okay, so extremely weak hand. I don't think this hand would have been keepable. It's hard to see what is in his hand. I'm not sure what he was counting before making the decision. It could all be control magic, which I wouldn't put it past Nick to keep. That he's a control player, but he wanted to dip his toe into Legacy, and this was the spare deck that I had that he could use. So kept a hand of Dismember, so not terrible. Although does need to pay 6 mana for it, or 6 life for it, which is very heavy. That's almost half your life. Fernando thinking about the Force of Will. He has another Blighted Agent in hand, so next turn he can go land, play Blighted Agent, and then if Nick has another removal spell, he has the Apostle's Blessing. So he does opt to Force of Will. I don't think I would have done that. It might be the mind game of I want to protect. I want to show that I want to protect this, and this is the only threat that I have to try and get Nick to use another removal spell on it. And then if Nick does use another removal spell on it, then he just deploys another one, which is very good. Gets both removal spells out of Nick's hand. Okay, Nick playing Bubble Bubble Mox Opal and plays Sai. So he loses out on a Thopter here, but it's kind of irrelevant because the Blighted Agent does have unblockable. Blighted Agent attacking for 1, activating Pendelhaven to pump it, making it 2 poison. Passes the turn, Nick untaps. There's a Thought Cost in hand. Didn't see what he drew off the top. So there is a Thought Cast. So Nick floating 1 mana, I believe. It costs 3. So there's a Seat of the Synod. And can't use that last point of mana. Fernando drawing a third Force of Will. I think we saw that off the Ponder. Plays a Savannah, attacks for 2, pumps it up to 2 again. No other pump spells, so it's just incrementally 2. I wonder if there's a better style of play for Infect for Fernando. If he wants to play like a slow version of Infect like this, like obviously he's playing, the Invigorates, Vines of Vastwood, um, Berserk kind of like package. But I think if you're able to use Blighted Agent as a threat and Inkbot Nexus as an evasive threat, you can play a control style Infect list now with a lot of proliferate cards. Granted, the proliferate cards are not as efficient as regular legacy staples like Ponder, Brainstorm, Preordain, and stuff like that, but it offers a little bit more of an inevitability game plan rather than a aggressive, like a weird control-y aggressive game plan. Like he's currently getting incremental beats in with this Blighted Agent, which is okay, but if you want to play like a full control style list to just put an infect counter on and then proliferate it and control the opponent into oblivion, that's also inevitable. And you aren't as dead in the water to removal spells. So now Nick is deploying the 8-cast strategy, which is draw a bunch of cards and either control the opponent or accrue a massive board to overwhelm the opponent. He's in an awkward position because I don't think he's found a way to deal with this Blighted Agent, and he sees that there's a second Blighted Agent in hand. So even if he deals with his Blighted Agent and Fernando lands another Blighted Agent, Fernando also has the backup Force of Will just in case. And Nick is aware of the Apostle's Blessing. So this is a double Emery on one turn. I think he's just digging through the deck to find an answer. Not a bad strategy, especially from the hand that he kept. It really did nothing for like basically 3 turns. I don't think that's where you want to be at all. Like Legacy's very proactive environment unless your deck is strictly built to be reactive, and even if you're a reactive deck, you're generally proactive in some sort of way. A good example is like the Jeskai control decks. They use like control the like a card like Narset restricts the opponent. Oh, there's a Become Immense. So is he tapping this Pendelhaven to cast Become Immense, or is he pumping it in addition to Become Immense? Looks like he's tapping it for Become Immense. Okay, Nick cracking the Lotus Petal, probably for blue mana. There's a Flusterstorm. So Storm count is at 2, so he needs to pay 2 mana to... Well, he needs to pay 1 mana twice to have this go through. So I think he can tap to pay for 1 Flusterstorm and then Force of Will either the original or the copy, and then this Become Immense will be resolved. And it looks like it goes through. And that is the game. So that was Infect versus 8-cast, Fernando versus Nick, which is Gorehound versus Nick 83838383. And Fernando takes it in 3.